On behalf of the UNT College of Information, I'd like to welcome you to the Discovery Lecture Series. We are delighted to have with us this morning Dr. Rob Moore. Dr. Moore is an assistant professor of educational technology at the University of Florida in the School of Teaching and Learning. He's also the director of the Investigating Digital Ecologies to Advance Transformative Education, or the IDIATE Research Lab at the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies. Dr. Moore asked the question, how do learners succeed in an increasingly complex and interconnected world? And his research attempts to answer this question through focused research on engagement, digital ecologies, and learning analytics. Studying learner relationships and digital ecologies means examining structure and engagement to inform actionable strategies to improve learning experiences. He explores these relationships through learning analytics to identify patterns in learner behavior that can influence learning design. And we are excited to have him with us and look forward to hearing from Dr. Moore about charting new pathways to academic credit with Mesocredentials. So welcome, Dr. Moore.
Thank you so much for having me. I recognize several of the names in the participant list, so thank you so much for joining, and thank you for that great introduction. So some housekeeping items. If you want to follow along on Twitter, post questions or anything of the sort, feel free to use at RobMoore3 or UNTCOI. So for those that are just joining late, wanted to reiterate, so I'm an assistant professor of educational technology in the School of Teaching and Learning here at the University of Florida. It's in the College of Education. I'm also one of the AI faculty that's been hired as part of the AI initiative, and I am a faculty member in the Institute of Advanced Learning Technologies, which we call IALT. As part of my relationship with IALT, I have formed a research lab, which is as very wordy as is typical for academics. So it's investigating digital ecologies to advance transformative education. So one of the things I'm really interested in understanding is how can we improve the educational experience? How can we research those? How can we leverage things such as machine learning? How can we use systems thinking? All things that we're going to talk about briefly in this presentation today. So one of the things I want to challenge everyone to do and really think about as we go through this presentation is really think about what your perspective is. So we have the same image 4 different times, but based off of how you're looking at it, it may change how you interpret and understand this stuff. So for some people, you may see a duck at the very top and it looks like it's very calm moving through the water. But then you also know that ducks a lot of times are scrambling underwater. So they may be scrambling to keep up. Or you may only see the legs or you only may see the top part. So perspective is really going to be important. So I challenge you to really think about what perspective you're using as you're considering this as we look at these transformative approaches to academic credit. So we have what's called the factory model view of the education system. This is the typical, stereotypical, prototypical approach that we've used for educational system. And at the top right, you see that we have students coming in and then they come out. And along the ways, we get rid of that creativity, discipline, and intelligence. So this is the factory model. This is kind of the one-size-fits-all approach. But as we know, this simply is not the way education works. Instead, if we think about it, education is such a complex system. So there's all kinds of different stakeholders, different influences. There's different things that are all happening at once. And it can be a bit chaotic. One of the things that we can do is we can think about a continuum. And this continuum is from the pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy continuum. So one way that we can think about this is learner autonomy. So if we think about learner autonomy, there's different approaches. So if we took a pedagogical approach, that would be something like with the LMS that we use, our learning management system. So it might be Blackboard, it could be Moodle, it could be Sakai. So one of the things that we think about when we have a pedagogical approach and we have a low learner autonomy, this is going to be when the instructor launches the course site, but only lets the students see what they're going to be working on for that given week. So even though it may be a 16-week course, you only see week 1, and then the teacher releases week 2. When we go to the andragogical approach, that is going to have a little bit more learner autonomy. So what that may look like in the same course, maybe a 16-week course, what's going to end up happening is that the entire course is going to be open, but the teacher's going to talk about each week that they're working on. So learners have a little bit of ability, they can move around a little bit, but they are still guided through and the instructor is still involved. And then that final approach is going to be the pedagogical approach. That is going to have the most learner autonomy. This is going to be something similar to like a self-paced, massive open online course, where basically the entire course is open. You can navigate however you want to. You can start, stop, you can drop out, you can go to week 6 if you want to, or week 2. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to do that. But one of the challenges with this is that learners don't always know how to self-regulate. And as we move on this continuum, as we move from the pedagogical to the heutagogical approach, they're going to need to know how to do self-regulation. And that can be a challenge. And the reason why this is a challenge is that we have to consider how many learners are engaged in online learning, and they have what's considered competing learner needs. So what's going to end up happening is that you're going to have some learners who are engaged in these open courses that are looking for career maintenance. So they are told, hey, if you complete this course, you're going to be able to get a promotion or just simply get this certification, prove it to me, and we can maintain your license. Then you're also going to have learners who are looking for career advancement. So they're looking to take these online courses because they're engaged in an opportunity to move. So let's say they're currently an assistant director, they want to become an associate director. So they're going to be all in that same course. And it becomes a challenge for instructors because we're trying to develop online courses that are meeting learner needs, but in many ways, these can be competing learner needs. For any of you who've taught an online class, you may see this as an example of when you're teaching an online graduate class and you have graduate students and you also have certificate students. You may experience the certificate students are going to be more interested in simply that career maintenance side, whereas the graduate students may be more interested in career advancement. And this can cause some conflicts in how they're receiving your instruction. It can be a challenge. And one of these perspectives is it brings up this quote from the Prince of Chaos, the Joker. And one of the things that he talks about is a little anarchy is actually important. It's necessary to mess up the established order. So when we think about the Joker, oftentimes, remember I was telling you about perspective, many times we see the Joker as being a villain within Gotham. But there's a possibility, there's a perspective that you can use that the Joker was actually good. The Joker was actually someone that was helping to figure out a way to navigate things and figure out a way to figure out those gaps, right? And sometimes chaos is necessary for your system. So you could be an agent of chaos. And oftentimes when we hear the word chaos, we think about this meme. We think about, oh, everything is fine, everything is going okay, but everything is burning around, right? But in the educational context, when we're thinking about chaos, when we talk about chaos, what we're really talking about is chaos theory. We're talking about a theory that has been advanced by Dr. Charles Reguluth, who does a lot of work about chaos theory, specifically in educational context. So when we talk about chaos theory, the person that we want to think about more about chaos theory is the venerable Dr. Ian Malcolm. So anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge fan of Jurassic Park. And if you remember from the original Jurassic Park that came out in 1993, there's a scene as they're first entering the park where there's a conversation about what is this chaos that you keep talking about? And Dr. Ian Malcolm explains that chaos theory deals with unpredictability in complex systems. So basically, his whole premise was it was a mistake for us to think that we could make these dinosaurs and put them in a cage and they weren't going to get out, right? There's going to be chaos that happens and we can't quite control it. So if you remember that movie, think about that and think about chaos theory, because that's the chaos theory that we're talking about as it relates to educational context. So what I have done is I worked and looked at what Dr. Charles Reguluth did. He has 8 phases of chaos theory. And what I've done is I've adapted those and looked at them more of a transformative approach to academic credit. So the first step is going to be this coevolution. So it's going to be when we have online learning and adult learners. So we think back in time. So we go back to about 2008. In 2008, we had a recession. We had a huge uptick in the need for online learning. There were a lot of learners who were looking for new careers. They had just been laid off. They're trying to shift. So there's this influx of students who are looking for online learning. This is also about the same time we start to see a shift in the educational approach. Prior to 2008, in the early periods, online learning was considered something separate. Traditional brick and mortar schools were like, we don't do online learning. We don't really offer that. Everyone needs to be on campus. And it followed a very traditional model where students are going to be on campus for 4 years and they're going to do 130 undergraduate credits, and that's what they're going to do. But we started to see around 2008, we started to see a shift in that. We started to see there's going to be some opportunities and there's more need for adult learners who are being non-traditional and look for that. So we see that as the coevolution stage. The next stage, now it's called disequilibrium and positive feedback. And one of the things is that disequilibrium is normally considered a bad word, something pejorative, something that's not going to be a positive thing. But actually, in this context, within chaos theory, it's actually considered something good. So what ends up happening is you have to have some kind of seismic change within the system that's going to result in a reaction to it. In this case, one of the things that we can look at is in 2012, we started to see MOOCs developed. Because remember, in 2008, we saw this need for online learning. So MOOCs were essentially a positive feedback, a response to that. And what the idea was that, hey, we can open up education and make it more accessible, more available to learners. We have all these learners who are looking to access this education resources from these institutions, but they can't all get to campus. They don't all have that mobility. So MOOCs were supposed to be an opportunity. They were supposed to be a disruptor to the higher education system. However, one of the things that we've learned is that lifelong learning credentialing are key parts. As we looked at MOOCs, one of the challenges, what does it mean to be in a MOOC? What is the purpose of the MOOC? What are you going to get from that? What does that certificate mean for you? And we started to see a shift, and there's a recent systematic review that saw a shift around 2016, 2015. We started to see that the MOOC providers started to look at more credentialing. How can they provide a credential that has value that can then be linked to lifelong learning? So that's the third phase. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing the shift that we started off with. There's a need for online learning. The response was maybe MOOCs could be the way to do it. And then the shift now is like, okay, we need to start credentialing. So if you go online, you'll see different things such as these boot camps, these other opportunities that you can take these great opportunities online and you can turn it into careers. So they're trying to make that connection and create that value. And then the final stage, which is where we are right now, is we're looking at that transformation stage. And that's with the academic credit. So what ends up happening with this is, can we figure out a way to go from, hey, we have all these learners who want to be engaged online. We have a potential platform that was developed in response to that. We have an opportunity to credential that learning. And can we transition that into academic credit? If we can get all these things to work together, we can really have a transformative approach to academic credit. So you may have heard a term of micromasters. You may have also heard the term Mesocredentials. So I want to make a connection for you. So when we think about micromasters, think about Xerox. So Xerox is a trademark term. Micromasters is a trademark term. In 2015, edX, which is a major provider of MOOCs, decided to trademark the term micromasters. And their concept is very similar to Xerox because there are Xerox machines. But when I talk about Mesocredentials, I'm talking about a copy machine. So similarly, just like copy machines and Xerox machines can be used interchangeably, micromasters and Mesocredentials can be used interchangeably. The reason why I use the term Mesocredentials is because Mesocredentials is a concept similar to a copy machine. It's not so much about the brand name, it's more about what it represents. And one of the things that's going to be important to understand is that because of edX trademarking the term micromasters, the only thing that could be a micromaster is something on the edX platform, which is actually limiting. So that's why I came up with this term Mesocredentials. And let me explain briefly about what Mesocredentials are. So we are familiar with microcredentials. We're familiar with those completion certificates that you've done. So this could be something like when you went on LinkedIn Learning and you have proof that you did a communications class or a Photoshop class. It could also within the MOOCs current ecosystem is when you completed a MOOC, you got a certificate that says, hey, you've completed this MOOC. So that was the badge certificates of completion. The problem with that is that there's a gap between those micro credentials and the the micro-credentials and the macro-credentials. So macro-credentials are academic degree programs. So for those of you who are in graduate school, you may have a master's degree, you may have an undergraduate degree, you may have some type of degree that has been awarded by an institution that has value. So when you take that undergraduate degree, that master's degree, that PhD, it means something. So that's a macro-credential. So what I have developed is Mesocredentials, which sits in between. So basically the way the Mesocredential works is an opportunity for us to take that micro learning that was done in the MOOC and convert it to academic credit that we can use towards an academic degree program. So this is a very transformative approach because it's actually addressing, if we think back to our process, it's filling in a lot of the gaps. Because what this is going to be able to do, it's going to give value to those MOOC learners. So you complete that MOOC-based learning, and now you can take that and you can actually earn academic credit to be applied towards your graduate degree or your undergraduate degree. So that is why this is so transformative and has such great potential. So when we're thinking about what a Mesocredential is, it's helpful to think of it similar to high school AP exams. For those of you who remember, when you had the opportunity, you could have taken an AP exam. So you took an AP class throughout your entire career, and then there was an exam that you could take. If you passed this exam, you scored between a 3 and a 5, depending on your institution, you're able to get academic credit for that. And the reason why this is very similar to the Mesocredential concept is similar to that when you got your AP exam and you went to your undergraduate institution and say, I want credit for Latin or physics, they looked at what your score was and said, okay, we're going to give you credit for that. They never asked for the syllabus. They didn't look at what courses and what content you're covering in your class. They just accepted it. They essentially had articulation agreements with the AP exam. That's very similar to how the Mesocredential works. So there's a couple processes. There's 4 processes for the Mesocredential learning process. The first is that a higher ed institution has to create this. So part of the reason for the flexibility and the actual ability for to earn academic credit, it has to be by a higher ed institution. Now, one of the alarming things that some people will say is like, wait a second, this is causing some of this us versus them type of things. And actually, I actually believe it's the opposite. It's actually opening things up. So think about it this way. Let's say you wanted to get access to content and instructors from MIT, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania. These are all top tier schools, but you weren't able to afford that. You couldn't get there. However, if those schools decide they want to create a Mesocredential, you have the opportunity to learn from these top tier institutions and access their content. So what these institutions would do is they would create 4 to 6 courses, and these would be their MOOCs that they would offer. And they would sequence them and say, okay, here are the particular MOOCs. So let's say it was a statistics MOOC. These are the ones that you need to take. If you pass each of these courses, you're going to have value, and that is going to be the first part of it. So the learner has to pass each of those MOOCs. So then they earn that micro-credential they earned before. So essentially it'd be the 4 certificates they've completed. So they have a micro-credential now that they've passed these different courses. The next step, and here's where it shifts from the traditional approach to this transformative approach. Within the Mesocredential, and what the higher ed institution will do is they will create some type of achievement requirement. So it's going to be some type of capstone exam or a final project. In order to be eligible to do this, they had to have passed the 4 previous MOOCs. Once they take that capstone exam, that's going to be, so for instance, Purdue for engineering, they have a requirement that you have to get at least 80% in all the previous 4 MOOCs, and you have to get an 85% maybe in the final exam. Or if it was a design thinking MicroMasters program, you would do a final project where you would demonstrate that. So there's some type of thing that you demonstrate. So going back to the AP exam, this achievement requirement is when you sat for the AP exam. The final thing is if you have been able to meet each of those 3 checkpoints, so you've been able to enroll in the program, you complete the 4 to 6 MOOCs, you've passed each of them, and you also have passed this achievement requirement, you now have what's considered a Mesocredential. And this Mesocredential has value, and it will be able to be transferred into other programs. So institutions are able to accept this Mesocredential because it says, hey, you've completed this MIT course, you've completed this Harvard sequence of courses, and you've reached their standards. We recognize that. very similar to how the AP exam works. So right now what we have is we essentially have two buckets, or three buckets rather. We have some institutions who are just simply offered a Mesocredential. So that's an institution that says, hey, we have this course, we have these sequence of courses, we are going to do that. There's other institutions who are only accepting Mesocredentials. So what they're saying is that we don't have the capacity to put on these MOOCs, but we understand, we essentially have an articulation agreement. So if you pass this MIT statistics MOOC, we know that you have done good work, we're going to accept that. And then there's also some institutions that have some overlap. They're both offering and accepting Mesocredentials. So you think about, okay, this sounds great. Is anyone actually doing this? And the answer is yes. As of the last time I checked, there was 58 MicroMasters programs offering the edX platform from 32 institutions. So that's a tremendous amount of interest in these types of programs. So these are going to be opportunities for learners to be engaged with the content. And these 32 institutions are international. So they are both domestic ones, such as University of Minnesota, Indiana University, Purdue University, and also international ones as well. We also have several institutions that have said, you know what, I think this MicroMasters and Mesocredentials is a great idea. We don't have the capacity to teach the content, but we're going to accept that, right? So when you go to the edX website, it will list the different programs and will also list what you can do once you've completed this. And this is the part that really becomes a transformative approach, because here is a real opportunity that we have to really expand this, right? So what we have experienced, we know that we have completion issues. We have some challenges with MOOCs, but we have institutions that are saying, hey, we think this actually has potential. We want to open this up. So think back to when you're going through high school. When you're in high school, if you didn't have access to take the AP exam, you could never earn that academic credit, right? The MOOCs are actually opening that up. So that means that you're not time bound or not location bound. So you actually have the opportunity to demonstrate you have this knowledge. And we're starting to see many learners, non-traditional learners who are enrolling in traditional academic programs are trying to adapt and convert this work they've done in MOOC-based learning into academic credit for their own degrees. So what I'm expecting to see is that we're going to start to see a development of this over time and some growth. So I want to talk briefly about research questions, and I'm also going to leave quite a bit of time for questions because I know this is a new concept and there tends to be quite a bit of questions. So one of the things that we're looking at for research completion rates is we're looking at what has happened is that we're having an issue with tangible value in completing MOOCs. So as I said before, one of the things that we see typically when we see MOOC completion rates, what they do is they take the number of people who enrolled divided by the number of people who completed. So they say, oh, there was a 3% completion rate. Well, that's kind of a flawed thing because how many of us have all enrolled in the MOOC just because we are curious, we want to look at something, we want to look at the course curriculum, we want to see how it was structured, and we never had any intention of actually completing it. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to really drive down and look at that better. Because remember that enrollments are driven by student interest. So the key part of this is what we need to do is look at what I consider learner intention fulfillment. Specifically, what we want to do is we want to narrow down this enrollment. So students were enrolled, but we want to find the students who wanted to complete the course, and those that wanted to complete the course, were they successful? And if they're not successful, what could we do to improve that? So there has not been any significant work on that, specifically with the Mesocredentials, because one of the things to think about is that this has a potential to really open up education. However, we don't know how many people are doing that. So I'm very excited to share, and I've shared it on social media. I was recently awarded a Spencer Foundation Small Research Grant Award to do just that, to address that gap. Specifically, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at a Mesocredential, statistics Mesocredential, and I want to examine learner intention fulfillment. So the learners shared what they wanted to do from the course, why they enrolled, and I'm going to use the log files, use machine learning, and I'm going to look and see, of those students who said they wanted to pass, how many of them actually passed the course? For those that didn't pass the course, what type of learner behaviors could they have done that would have improved their likelihood of doing that? The reason why that's significant is if we can let learners know before they start a course what the expectations are beyond just spend 5 to 8 hours a week working on it, we can improve their access to this education. There's a question here that I'll take. The question for everyone is, I'm wondering how you see this lining up with some of the course sharing strategies employed by smaller schools looking to expand their curriculum offerings to bolster enrollment numbers. So that's a great question. So one of the things about this is that this is the potential that you're going to be able to reach learners who you may not have been able to reach before. Now, even though I've said this is a transformative approach, I don't see this as being like all of a sudden we're eliminating all residential traditional programs. In fact, there was a study that was done in 2018, I believe, that looked at the supply chain MicroMasters program, and they actually found that learners who completed the MicroMasters before they did the traditional program outperformed the students who did the traditional program. One of the reasons for doing that is that it was able to teach learners how to do self-regulated learning, how to manage their time, and they really were able to dive deeper and really get familiar with the content before they entered the traditional program. So in many cases, it was actually a great preparation for learners as they adjusted their schedules. So one of the things that smaller schools can do is a smaller school that maybe is having some capacity issues could use a Mesocredential as an opportunity to attract new students. So like I said, remember, we go back to the previous slide where we're looking at those institutions who are accepting a Mesocredential. So that could be an opportunity that, hey, we don't have capacity to teach everyone the statistics class, or it may be an issue that we don't have classes make. So one of the things that you could do is you could say, hey, I'm a smaller school, I'm trying to attract some different non-traditional learners. I can go and say, hey, you know what, if you do these different Mesocredentials, I'll give you academic credit for that. And then when you come in, we can do more delve into deeper concepts. Another way to think about it is think about the flipped classroom model. So in a flipped classroom, what you do is you move some of your instruction online, so they may be watching videos. And then in the in-person class, what you're able to do is really delve deeper into it. The same thing could be done for this. So what you could essentially do is you could have students do that work, that foundational work. Think of, I'm in instructional design. There are 45 instructional design sections going on currently right now, teaching the exact same thing from the same content, the same stuff, right? We don't necessarily need to have 45 sections teaching the same foundations of educational technology. What we could do is we could create a MOOC, a Mesocredential, about instructional design foundations. And in fact, University of Maryland has just such a program. So what we could do is University of Florida, University of North Texas, they could say, you know what, we're going to allow learners to complete University of Maryland's instructional design Mesocredential, and then we're going to give you 9 hours of graduate credit towards your master's degree or your PhD. So you don't have to take that class, it's not redundant. That would then free up the faculty to maybe do some other more specialized courses or special topics they wanted to do. And I have a couple other questions. Let's see. Yeah, so one question is, this is potentially groundbreaking. What might be the business model here? Overall, higher education institutions often operate on a cost recovery models. So that's one of the things to think about. So I don't think that we're going to have a situation where we're going to have 50,000 students necessarily doing this. I think it's going to be relatively small. So one of the things about it is, yes, there is a little bit of a loss of revenue because the 5 or 6 students per cohort may not be taking those foundation classes, right? So you may lose a little bit of money that way. However, I would argue and suggest that from a business model standpoint, those 5 or 6 students who went through the Mesocredential before they did your program may not have enrolled in your program at all. And they're going to pay for the second part of their degree when they're going to be on campus with you. So what you've done is you've actually expanded your pool and you're actually making education more equitable. And I think you can get your money back that way. In terms of cost recovery, one of the other things too to think about is we deal with it all the time, particularly any faculty members who are working with PhD students. We take 30 hours of academic credit towards our PhD. We're not charging any money for that. Many of our programs have maybe 90 hours, but 30 of that comes from the master's degree. There's no reason why some of that 30 hours couldn't be a Mesocredential. So it actually wouldn't impact it at the PhD level. So we're already kind of doing this. But what we need to do is we need to really look for an opportunity to really expand that. How can get started with Mesocredentials? So one of the ways they can do that, and one of the ways you can do that is you can go to edX. So Mesocredentials, like I said, I'm using interchangeably. Currently, the most established example of a Mesocredential is actually the MicroMasters that are by edX. If you go to the edX webpage, they have a whole section on MicroMasters. And what you can see is you can see different institutions that are engaged with it. So if your institution was interested in doing it, let's say the University of Maryland Instructional Design, you would just need to talk with your local, your provost or your department chair and say, hey, I think that we should start accepting this credit for this purpose. And then what you will do is you'll coordinate your contact edX and say, hey, our institution is going to start accepting this particular MicroMasters since it's on the edX site. And then they would just update the website and add your institution on there. The benefit would then be that you could then link it on your page. But if you go on that edX site, you'll see that there's links going from these different MicroMasters programs into the other institutions. So it becomes a bit of a recruitment tool. Like I said, you may only get 2 or 3 students, but if you think about all the programs across the country, if we can identify an opportunity for 4 or 5 students across the spectrum, across all of our institutions, that's a lot of learners that we can do. One of the things that we can also look at is workforce development. So this could offer some flexibility for how learners gain new skills and competencies. There was a recent thing from the National Clearinghouse that showed that there are 39 million Americans over the age of 25 that have some college but no credential. And we know for a fact that we have a STEM workforce issue. So we have a disconnect. We have an issue where we need a highly trained, educated STEM workforce. We have a large 39 million adults who don't have a credential. Mesocredentials could be a way to bridge that gap. But one of the things that we need to look at is that because it's supporting informal online learning, we need to make sure learners have the skill sets to be able to handle that. So one of the things that we can look at are where are the gaps in workforce development and how can Mesocredentials fill those gaps? Part of that is me doing talks like this is to bring awareness to this, because the more we can do to have higher education understand that this exists, the more we can have them implement it. And the more they implement it, the more we can make those connections, because higher education is all about preparing people for the workforce. So if there's ways that we can figure out ways to better prepare the workforce, we can bring some of those learners. We can really address that gap that we have, that 39 million that need some credentialing. We can maybe get that through the Mesocredentials. That's an area of research that I hope to explore. There's a question here about how does this differ from prior learning credit? It's very similar to prior learning credit. It's the same concept. The thing about this, very specifically, a Mesocredential is very specifically based on MOOC-based learning. This is going to be online learning that's happening in these informal, formal learning environments, and it's learning that's being done by a higher ed institution. So that is what the core part of for a Mesocredential. Now, prior learning can happen in different contexts and has different regulatory and accreditation things. And that's one of the key things about this, is that because we're focused on MOOC-based learning from an institution, we don't have those accreditation issues. I find it hard to believe there's any institution in the United States that would question a learner who demonstrated that they had successfully passed MIT level courses. I think we would accept that because that is a top tier institution that we're familiar with. When I mentioned there's 32 institutions, these are all institutions that we're familiar with. These are top tier institutions. This is not a situation where we have lower tier institutions that are simply trying to create these as a way to make money off of learners. What it actually is, it appears to be, and the trend it is, it's actually the other way around. We have top tier, high end institutions that are like, we know how to do this online learning. We've mastered this. We have the capacity to do it. And what we want to do is we want to make it more equitable and accessible to learners. And that's the shift that we're seeing. And that's the shift that I hope that we will continue to see. So as I mentioned, this is one of the ways that we can leverage technology. We have these platforms. We have Udacity. We have edX. We have Coursera. These platforms are already in place that can handle a huge number of learners. We already know institutions that have mastered this concept of delivering MOOCs. Stanford, Harvard, MIT, University of Texas, University of Maryland, Georgia Tech University. These institutions have been doing MOOCs for a while, and they have figured it out, and they are developing high quality instruction. What we need to do is we need to figure out a way to take that high quality instruction and transform it and adapt it into academic context so we can create that value and we can address some of these gaps that we're having. If we can do that, I think that we can really start to see some equitable and accessible issues, because now all of a sudden it doesn't matter where you're located. As long as you can demonstrate you have the capacity, the competency, you can get that academic credit that's going to propel you to these more rewarding and high-paying careers. So one of the research areas I want to look at, two key questions, is who intends to complete and what are the backgrounds? So one of the things that we want to understand is we want to really focus on that intention of completion, because that is going to be how we can figure out how to make things more successful. And once we look at that, we can also look at the backgrounds of those who are not completing. One of the things that's challenging, anyone who's ever signed up for a MOOC knows that sometimes it's not clear what background knowledge you need to have. So what ends up happening sometimes is students start the class and then they get lost. They get, oh my gosh, this is too much math, this is too much science. I wish I had taken this before. They drop out and they may return later. But if we could do a better job of understanding what the backgrounds are to be successful for the programs and put that on the front end, it will be better for learners because they know what to expect when they go into things. We see this all the time with our traditional classes, right? So many of us are teaching a class and we know there's a prerequisite. We know how to structure that. That kind of information we need in the MOOC space, so learners are going to be able to be more successful and be able to be more strategic in how they're taking these courses. And then specifically looking at adult learners, one of the things that we absolutely have to do, and again, perspective matters. The traditional approach to academic credit is not working. It does not work. This approach that we have with our higher ed institutions, where we think that the brick and mortar schools are set up for residential 4 years, students are going to be here full time, is simply not the case. We're seeing an older demographic. We're seeing that people are starting families. They have other challenges. We're seeing that. That's why we see a press for more online education. We need to figure out more alternative pathways to academic credit. As an earlier question asked about prior learning credit, we have micromasters, we have micro bachelors, we have all these different ways that people can learn. We need to figure out a way to change this academic credit model that requires them to be physically in a seat and allow opportunities to get these alternative pathways. Now, I understand there's accreditation challenges that we have to deal with, but I think that we can make those changes because we're the ones who created the accreditation standards to begin with. So there's no reason why we can't change that. And one of the things that we need to really look at is that we know there's alternative pathways. So we do have issues where we have things such as Coursera has the professional certificates, we have the MicroMasters, we have prior learning, we have other institutions who have done things such as, okay, I'm doing a teacher education master's degree, I'm going to accept credit from someone who has the Google, who's a Google certified instructor or Apple certified instructor. So we have all these alternative pathways, but one of the things that we really need to look at is we need to look at who is taking advantage of these pathways, and are MOOCs the right vehicle for these pathways? In principle, they would be, because they can handle a huge number of learners concurrently, but is that the right pedagogical approach? I'm not certain. We need to figure out where the barriers are in the implementation of these pathways, and then how can we remove them? What kind of remediation support can we provide? So one of the things, an idea, I was talking with a friend, and they were like, what if we created the Amazon of education, right? So what if we had a situation set up where you could go to this education marketplace and you could meet with an instructor who for $100 a week would tutor you or answer your questions that you're having when you're in this MOOC, or you could form study groups. There could be these different marketplaces, right? These non-traditional approaches that we have seen work in other contexts that I think could work in the educational context. So I have run through several things I wanted to share with you. So these are QR codes. So if you're interested in reading more about the Heutagogy paper where I talk about learner autonomy, there's this paper the Mesocredential paper is what we've talked about today. So you can download it from the middle one. It's in distance education. However, I understand also that there may be an embargo. So the third link is actually going to a request. So if you fill out the form and you give your name and your email address, I can send you a copy of the paper if you want to read more about the Mesocredentials. So I want to hang tight on this slide rather, and answer some of the questions that we have in our remaining time here. So if you have other questions, please add them to the chat. Benjamin's question is, how do Mesocredentials relate to stackability? Do they necessarily involve MOOCs, or could they involve other kinds of micro-credentials? So that's a great thing. So one of the things I was wrestling with when I was looking at it, I specifically made the Mesocredentials about MOOCs because I wanted to focus on MOOC-based learning. And I saw that, and since I situated in chaos theory, I really saw this as an opportunity for us to really see a better way to integrate MOOCs into the higher education landscape. Now, that being said, there are other opportunities for micro-credentials, such as, let's say, LinkedIn Learning and turning that into academic credit. One of the problems with that, and one of the key issues that we know is with academic credit, it's all about that accreditation. And one of the reasons why I focused on MOOCs is because I specifically focus on ex-MOOCs because it's a higher ed institution. And there's not going to be the same accreditation issues because it's going to be from an institution, as opposed to you can get a micro-credential. What are the academic credentials of someone who's on LinkedIn Learning? That's not necessarily a requirement. There's very high quality content, but it doesn't necessarily tell, it may cause issues for giving academic credit for that because there's no academic institution behind it, right? But there's definitely going to be some opportunities for stackability. So the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, is one of the only institutions right now, and I think there could be others, and they have said they will accept up to 3 different Mesocredentials towards graduate credit. So you can get about 18 hours, I believe, you can get towards one of their Masters in Professional Studies, I believe it is. So they have really made an effort to really democratize this Mesocredentials approach and allow some of that stackability. Hopefully I answered your question. I think
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Do we have other questions?
So it's a transformative approach. One of the interesting reactions I've had with this, and this is new for me as well to learn about it, is the reaction often is, oh my gosh, I had no idea this even existed. I had no idea this was even a possibility. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the paper I did. That's part of the reason I'm doing the research, because I really believe that if more people understood this actually exists, then more people would use it and it will really open things up. The problem is we're in a situation where there's so much information out there, it's kind of hard to find it. I was talking with a program officer and they commented that credentialing right now is kind of like the wild, wild west. There's not a lot of structure around it. So one of the things, and the reason why I came with the term Mesocredentials, because I really think that there's something potentially here with this MOOC-based learning for academic credit. And we need to get a name for it, and we need to get the discussions about it. So that's why I'm super excited to be able to give this talk. We've got the paper in business education. So what I'm trying to do is bring more awareness to it. I'm super excited to be doing some of the empirical work. So as I mentioned, I have a Spencer Foundation grant, and it's going to be the first empirical study of statistics and Mesocredential programs and really look at that learner intention and really analyze what is happening from the point the students say they want to take the class to when they actually finish it. So I'm going to be using the log files and looking at are they in the discussion forum? Are they taking the quizzes? Are they watching the videos? If we can figure out what that path to success is, it can really open things up because there's people who are interested in this learning, but we need to figure out a way to better support them, even though they are in this self-paced open platform. I think there's some ways that we can provide some intervention, some scaffolding for them that will make them more successful. And for those that I've answered your questions, hopefully I answer your questions correctly. If there's any follow-up, I'm happy to answer it. So I will add to the chat the link for to request a paper. So if you fill out that form, that is the paper I wrote about Mesocredentials, where I talk about this in more detail. And happy to send that paper to you if you can't access it directly. Well, those are very positive reactions, and I'm glad that the response has been that. It's just a matter of getting this, people looking at it and exploring it. I really think one of the challenges we think about some of these transformative approaches, that sometimes it feels like you have to do a lot to get involved with it. It really doesn't cost that much. It actually costs nothing at all, because literally many of us are in a position where we are doing graduate curriculum. And it's as simple as deciding we're going to accept this particular credit. If anyone has demonstrated they have done these course, we're going to give them 9 hours of graduate credit. That is literally all it would take for you to be an institution accepting that. Now, you may not have a ton of response, but you are doing that. And if we all make a committed effort to do that, I think that we could really see some transformative changes over the course of the lifespan of online learning.
Does anyone else have a question?
I'll put my contact information if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer. And like I said, I can stick around for a couple extra minutes if you want to have a conversation off the recording. But feel free to send an email. Like I said, please, I'm happy to send a paper to anyone who's interested, and read about it and learn more about that. This is something I'm definitely obviously passionate about and interested in, and I really think it has some serious potential here to be transformative.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. These are some very innovative ideas. Excellent. Good food for thought as we work to re-envision the future of education and make it more accessible for others. So thank you for sharing your passion with us today. And congratulations on your Spencer Foundation grant. That's very exciting.
Thanks. The thing that's most exciting about that is it shows that this might be something that to convince reviewers to fund research into something that's so nascent is I think it's going to be very interesting, and I look forward to seeing what those results are and sharing that out and continue to build this momentum, because like I said, I really think this could change the way we approach academic credit across the educational landscape.
And those in the audience, I'm sure that Dr. Moore would appreciate your feedback on connecting your ideas or what you gained from this today. We would also like to hear, because at UNT we're continually working to make education work better for the students. So we'd love to hear your feedback as well.
Thank you for joining us today. We're really thrilled to learn about this topic and genuinely the path you're paving forward here in a new approach to academic credentialing. So thanks everyone for joining us, and please join me in thanking Dr. Moore for his time this morning. We are thrilled for that.